The city buzzed with its usual blend of late-night traffic, distant horns, and the low hum of life that never quite seemed to sleep. Nestled between old brick buildings and glimmering neon signs was the Ember Gate, a bar known for hosting corporate parties and casual meetups, standing as both a sanctuary and a battlefield for those who passed through its doors. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, sweat, and tension, an elegant chaos wrapped in dim lights and background jazz. Karen Waugh stood near the back exit, just outside the side door under the amber glow of a wall lamp, her posture tense but composed, her phone gripped tightly in one hand. She wore a beige blouse tucked into tailored black trousers, clean, professional, unbothered on the outside, though her inside told a different story. It had been a long evening filled with obligatory smiles and champagne flutes, the kind of corporate party she had become accustomed to, but not fond of. But what had begun as a formal event had slowly unraveled into something far more personal, more dangerous. Daniel had arrived uninvited, tall, well-dressed, and charming in that calculated way of his, but Karen's heart had dropped the moment she saw him enter the room. He made small talk with her colleagues, shook hands with her boss, and finally worked his way toward her, holding that same cold smile that once made her feel special but now only reminded her of the manipulation, the control, the pain she had endured behind closed doors. She had ended things only weeks ago after 2 long years of subtle emotional warfare, gaslighting, possessiveness, and a slow erosion of her self-worth masquerading as love. But Daniel wasn't the kind of man who accepted, no, easily. And tonight, he wasn't here to win her back, he was here to remind her that she could never fully escape him. As soon as he cornered her near the exit, his voice lowered and his words grew sharper, colder. "Leaving early. That's rude," he hissed, his tone laced with mockery and a barely veiled threat. Karen didn't respond at first. She had grown tired of the games, the emotional baiting, and tonight she wasn't going to take the bait. She simply turned to walk away, but Daniel grabbed her wrist, tightly. "You think you can just walk away from me like I'm no one?" He snapped, his voice rising just enough to attract the attention of a few patrons near the door. Karen yanked her hand back, her breath caught between defiance and fear. "Let go, Daniel," she said, calm but firm, her voice wavering slightly. That's when it happened. Without warning, without hesitation, he slapped her across the face, his palm landing with a sharp crack that echoed off the stone arch of the bar's exit. The impact turned her head violently, her hair whipping around her face as she staggered back a step. The world seemed to stop in that split second, the music inside still playing, the laughter still humming, but out here, everything was frozen. Karen stood stunned, her cheek already flushing red, her eyes wide, not just from the pain, but from the realization that he had finally crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And then, suddenly, a commanding voice cut through the air. "Step away from her, now." Officer Mitchell, tall and broad-shouldered in his navy blue uniform, had witnessed the entire altercation from across the street. He rushed in, hand already moving to his belt, eyes locked on Daniel with the sharp clarity of someone who had seen enough domestic assaults to know when to act without delay. Within seconds, he had Daniel restrained, one arm twisted behind his back, the other hand pushing him against the stone wall beside the gate. Daniel shouted in protest, struggling, his voice turning desperate and defensive, "It's not what it looks like. She's lying." But it was too late. The evidence was written across Karen's face, and the truth was loud enough in the silence that followed. A security guard from the bar, wearing a black cap labeled "Security," had been standing nearby but hadn't intervened in time. Now he stood frozen, unsure whether to help the officer or apologize for doing nothing. Karen slowly backed away from the wall, her hand trembling as it touched her bruised cheek. Her eyes met the guard's for a brief moment, a silent question passed between them: "Why didn't you stop him sooner?" But she didn't say anything. She didn't have the strength to speak yet. Soon, more police officers arrived. 2 blocked the front of the gate while another took Daniel's information. Officer Mitchell remained by Karen's side, speaking gently, asking if she needed medical attention, if she wanted to press charges. She nodded slowly, the decision already made for her the moment Daniel raised his hand. No more excuses. No more apologies for his behavior. This was no longer a private pain, it was a public crime. As the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car bathed the stone archway in surreal color, Karen stood straight, breathing deeply, trying to compose herself. Her heart was still racing, her body still shaking, but something inside her had shifted. The woman who had walked into that bar was no longer the same woman who now stood outside its gate. Something had broken, yes, but something stronger had also been born. And though her face still stung with the memory of his violence, it was her silence that had ended, and her resolve that had just begun. The night wore on, but the echo of that slap seemed to linger in the air long after the actual sound had faded. Outside the Ember Gate, the narrow alley-like entrance was now bathed in the swirling lights of two police cruisers, casting flashes of red and blue against the pale stone walls and the black iron gate that marked the boundary between the private establishment and the public street. The atmosphere was no longer casual or festive, it was sharp, tense, thick with a strange silence interrupted only by police radios crackling with static and the occasional cough or shuffle of boots on pavement. Officer Mitchell maintained a firm grip on Daniel as backup officers surrounded the area to contain the growing attention of nearby patrons. People inside the bar had started to whisper, peeking through windows, some stepping outside to see what the commotion was. The security guard, who had been stationed right beside the gate throughout the entire altercation, now looked deeply uncomfortable. His arms were crossed stiffly across his chest, his face blank, hiding the internal guilt that clawed at him for freezing at the very moment he had been paid and trained to act. Karen stood near one of the police cruisers, a soft blanket now draped around her shoulders by a female officer who had gently approached her after the initial arrest. Her face still bore the red imprint of Daniel's strike, a physical echo of the emotional scars she had long hidden. But even now, as adrenaline still pulsed through her veins, she wasn't thinking about the pain. She was thinking about control, how Daniel had always needed to be in control. How he'd whispered promises in one breath and delivered ultimatums in the next. How he made her feel like she owed him her silence. Tonight had shattered that illusion. And though her body was trembling from shock, a small voice in her mind was growing louder, steadier, clearer: "You are not his anymore." Daniel, now seated in the back of a police car with his wrists cuffed behind him, continued to rant, but only loud enough for the nearest officer to hear. His voice was a mixture of denial and desperation, trying to convince himself, or maybe the universe, that this was all a mistake. "It wasn't like that," he muttered, eyes darting out the window toward Karen, who refused to look at him. Officer Mitchell, standing nearby, overheard the mumbling but didn't respond. He had dealt with men like Daniel before, charming in public, terrifying in private. They always thought they could talk their way out of consequences. But not tonight. Mitchell had seen too much of it, and the evidence was undeniable. The mark on Karen's face, the fear in her eyes, and most of all, the silence that followed the impact, it was the kind of silence that screamed the truth. After a few minutes, Karen was gently guided to the side by one of the officers to give her statement. She recounted everything calmly, with measured words, though her voice trembled at times. She spoke not only about the slap, but about the controlling behavior, the uninvited appearance, and the way Daniel had grabbed her wrist before things escalated. As she spoke, the weight of months, no, years, of suppressed fear began to lift. Each word was a release, each sentence a wound unburied. When she finished, the officer nodded solemnly and asked if she wanted to press charges. Karen hesitated for only a moment before answering, "Yes. Absolutely." It wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. And protection. For herself, and for the part of her that still feared seeing Daniel's face again. While her statement was being recorded, the security guard approached the officers, unsure how to explain his inaction. "I didn't think he'd actually hit her," he said lamely. Staring at the ground, Officer Mitchell looked at him, not with anger, but disappointment. "Next time, don't think. Move. That's your job," he said bluntly, before turning back toward Karen. The guard nodded silently, swallowing a lump of shame. He hadn't been malicious, just passive. But sometimes, silence wasn't neutral, it was dangerous. As Daniel was finally driven away, the sound of the police car disappearing into the night was strangely satisfying. The alley slowly returned to quiet, but the tension still lingered like cigarette smoke clinging to a coat. Karen was offered a ride home by Officer Mitchell, and though she hesitated, she finally agreed. During the drive, they didn't speak much. The city lights passed through the window like a dream she was slowly waking up from. Her fingers fidgeted in her lap, playing with the fabric of the blanket still draped over her. Her face still burned from the slap, but there was something deeper that hurt, the recognition that it had taken this moment for her to fully break free. That all the smaller signs before hadn't been enough. That she had let herself believe love meant enduring pain. Mitchell, keeping one hand on the wheel, finally broke the silence. "You did the right thing tonight," he said quietly. Karen glanced at him and nodded. Her voice was soft but firm. I should have done it sooner." He shook his head gently. "What matters is, you did it now." When they reached her apartment, he made sure she was safely inside before leaving. Karen locked the door behind her, stood in the dim light of her hallway, and exhaled deeply for what felt like the first time in months. She touched her cheek again, this time not to check for pain, but to remind herself that it was real, that everything had changed. And somewhere, in the quiet of that empty apartment, a new chapter had begun. Not one dictated by fear or control, but one born from confrontation, truth, and the decision to never go back. The morning after the arrest, the sun rose quietly over the city, casting soft golden light on buildings still soaked in the memory of last night's chaos. Karen Waugh sat in silence by her window, a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands, her thoughts miles away from the present. The apartment was still, too still, except for the gentle creak of wooden floorboards beneath her feet as she shifted in her seat. She had barely slept. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the flash of Daniel's anger, the way his hand moved through the air, the heat of the strike, the burn on her cheek. But worse than that, she saw herself. Not just last night, but all the times before. The dinners where she swallowed her opinions. The mornings where she put on extra makeup to hide the red under her eyes, not from violence, but from tears. The moments when she told herself, "It's not that bad. He's just going through something. He loves me, doesn't he?" That illusion had shattered like glass beneath a falling weight, and now all she was left with was the sharp, undeniable clarity of truth. The phone buzzed beside her on the table. Dozens of missed calls. Some from coworkers who had witnessed parts of the scene at the bar. Others from friends who had heard about the arrest. A few from unknown numbers, likely Daniel's friends or even his lawyer, wanting to talk things through. Karen ignored them all. She wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. What could she say that would make sense of it all? That she had been in love with someone who had slowly erased her. That she had defended him even to herself. That her silence had nearly cost her her peace, her safety, maybe more. By noon, Karen forced herself to move. She got dressed, carefully. Every choice felt deliberate now. The soft blue sweater she wore wasn't just about comfort. It was about covering the fading mark on her cheek, not out of shame, but out of control. She decided what would be seen now. What would be told. Her mind drifted to the detective who had followed up with her that morning by phone. He had been polite, straightforward. He had reminded her that she might be called in to testify if Daniel fought the charges. The thought made her stomach turn, but she didn't hesitate when she told him, "I'll do it. Whatever it takes." That promise wasn't just for the court. It was for herself. She wasn't going to let him define her narrative. Not anymore. Later that day, she found herself walking without a destination, the city's streets both familiar and foreign beneath her feet. She'd passed a bookstore she used to visit often, but hadn't been to in over a year. Daniel had always said it was a waste of time. She lingered in front of the window, looking in at a small table marked, "New Arrivals," her reflection faint in the glass. The woman staring back at her looked tired, but grounded. Changed. She went inside and bought a journal. She didn't even read the description. She just knew she needed a place to put what words wouldn't leave her mind. Back at home, she began writing. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even coherent. But it was honest. She wrote about how the relationship began, how Daniel had been charming, attentive, even gentle in the beginning. How he'd made her feel chosen. How the red flags hadn't come all at once, but piece by piece. How, "Are you really going to wear that?" became, "Why do you talk to him so much?" Then slowly evolved into full-blown accusations, silent treatments, and emotional manipulation. And how, through it all, she had made excuses. Because when someone chips away at your confidence long enough, you stop believing in your own perception of reality. That's what he did. He rewrote her truth, day by day, until she questioned her own voice. But writing gave that voice back. That night, Karen finally opened her laptop and did something she'd put off for weeks. She began researching support groups, survivor circles, therapy centers, places where people like her could talk, listen, and heal. She realized she wasn't the first woman to be hurt by someone she trusted. And she wouldn't be the last. But maybe she could help make someone else's story end differently. Maybe she could be part of the voice that cuts through the silence. The next day, her neighbor stopped her in the hallway. Mrs. Lopez, a sweet elderly woman who often shared cookies and unsolicited advice, held her hand gently. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "You're brave, Karen. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Karen managed a small smile. It was one of the first genuine smiles she had felt in weeks. And in that simple moment, standing in the hallway of her building in sweatpants and a hoodie, with her hair tied messily back and her heart still raw, she realized something important: healing didn't look like strength. It looked like survival. Like showing up every day despite the fear. Like reclaiming your life inch by inch. That night, as she sat in bed with the journal beside her, Karen thought about how far she had come without even realizing it. Not long ago, she would have apologized for Daniel's actions. She would have hidden the truth to protect his image. But now, she was protecting her own. And for the first time, she was beginning to believe she deserved to. Outside her window, the city lights blinked against the dark sky, indifferent yet somehow comforting. She looked out at them and whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to herself, "You're free."